Good afternoon. Let's start with the questions. Question: did Stalin's 11th blow take place? Well, a counter question. What do you mean by 11th blow, whether it took place or not? Because Stalin's 10 blows is a well-known case connected with the offensive operations of the Soviet army during the Great Patriotic War. If you look at the question more broadly, that is, understanding that hybrid war, as a social global civilizational phenomenon, has existed for about the same time as the current global civilization, then, in the context of hybrid war, world global war, Stalin's 11th blow is Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR 1952 edition. The book, unfortunately, is not understood for the most part by either descendants or contemporaries. V.M. Molotov characterized it in the sense that Joseph Vissarionovich set out a lot of things in it, which really were not so. But, in reality, as Molotov himself admitted, he began to luxuriate. He simply could not read this book and correlate what was written with the reality that had taken shape in the USSR. Next question. How can one open up creative capabilities? It is impossible to open up creative capabilities while sitting in the lotus position or sitting comfortably on the sofa in the embryo position or another position. In order to open up creative capabilities, you need to engage in a real cause. A real cause in what sense? In the sense that it's necessary to engage in the solution of problems that affect not your beloved self, but many other people, both contemporaries and descendants. So, when a person finds such a cause and sincerely begins to engage in it, that is, orienting himself on the evaluations of his совесть and shame, but not on the evaluations of others, then creative capabilities themselves open up and begin to manifest themselves in this cause. Next question. How can you govern, restore, exchange, protect your energy? Are there any books? That which relates to this problem, as we understood it, we set out in the first volume of Fundamentals of Sociology, in the first part. But texts are texts, and life is life, and life is also a text, in the language of life circumstances, through which God speaks with all people and with every one of us, and through which we also speak with others, and with descendants, and with the Almighty. Therefore, if you correlate with the language of life circumstances, then, in order to protect your energy, provide all kinds of support to other people, first of all, your loved ones and close ones, you need to be attentive to what is happening around you and what is happening in your organism. If you are attentive and relate meaningfully to what is happening, and if you do not act against providence, then everything else, according to the concretics of your organism and your life, is realized by itself. Here, again, I want to emphasize that there is a certain difference between the Russian culture and the Vedic cultures, because different cultures of yoga are cultures of psychological hacking, in essence. When through the implementation of these or those psychophysiological practices, a predictable, desired for someone result is obtained in advance. And the fact that this result is accompanied by some side effects, and they are not always beneficial, this is perceived as an inevitable concomitant circumstance. Well, and by strength of the fact that it's inevitable, to ponder over whether it is dobro or evil is not customary. Everything is written off on the law of karma. In Russian culture, the approach is different, because, on the one hand, there really is a certain minimum of skills in mastering the body, mastering the spirit, which every person, in order to be a part of society, to make a solid contribution to its life, must possess. But everything else above this minimum, in the Orthodox tradition, refers to what is called the gifts of the Holy Spirit. In other words, if a person's personal potential does not allow something, he is not able to do something, he has not mastered something. But if these skills are necessary for the implementation of providence, then, in this case, if the person's nraviousness, his ethics, correspond to the tasks of providence, these skills and knowledge are given to him simply as a gift from above. Next question. What are the prospects for a neural net and conscious control chips with calling voices in the head? Well, what are the prospects? Read the Star Diaries of Ion Tichy by Stanislav Lem, A Journey to the Planet of the Idiots. In fact, if you deal with artificial intelligence and all the problems connected with it, big data, chipization, and so on, then, with the nraviousness and ethics that are characteristic of the vast majority of people in today's civilization, nothing good can come of it. Only the prospects from the Star Diaries of Ion Tichy, described back in 1952 by Stanislav Lem. If we talk about the cause conditionality of these prospects, then the nravious standards that every one of us carries are analogous to what in programming is called a conditional jump operator, and they govern all informational flows in the psyche. In the bygone days, as we understand, during the existence of the previous global civilization, all these inside voices were realized through the fact that all ordinary people were subordinated to the noosphere as a system of collective psyche which was governed by the pseudo-jretzes of that era. Accordingly, some occupied the highest levels in the hierarchy of the noosphere, and, through the noosphere, they governed the lives of all the others. When the global catastrophe occurred, the field structure of the planet, which carried the past noosphere, partially collapsed and partially lost the interconnection between the field body of egregors and people. Well, and since then, those pseudo-jretzes who survived that catastrophe and their successors. They have worked towards restoring the customary for them way of life. Since certain difficulties arose, in order to do this without computer networks, the internet, and further development of information processing technology, this did not work out. Then they went along the path of creating a technospheric prosthesis system of communication of people through the noosphere. The technology itself is twofold, because, on the one hand, it is a kind of plasticine, sand, in games with which unmatured humanity, in fact, cannot do anything very dangerous for itself and for others. Well, on the other hand, if people do not want to develop and do not want to become humans, in the sense that it is predetermined from above, then the technosphere can become a gravedigger of the current civilization, and the entire technology of artificial intelligence, big data, everything connected with this, and what has not yet been invented, can become a means of liquidation, self-destruction of this civilization. As I have already said many times, the main problem of today's civilization is that if you take culture out of consideration, then man is a herd pack monkey with low innate morality. But as soon as humanity takes the path of civilizational development, a technosphere, science appears, an interest in magic, parapsychology appears. From this moment, humanity ceases to be a weakly armed species and becomes an increasingly strongly armed species as these spheres of activity develop and become the property of culture. But if the power is still accompanied by the low innate morality of a herd pack monkey, then power and low innate morality, they are incompatible if we consider life more broadly than the life of an individual or the life of this or that nation or humanity. This is incompatible with the life of the universe. And therefore, in this system, the feedback lines are enclosed through the fact that cultures unwilling to develop are self-destroyed by one or another means. One of the variants is that the technosphere becomes a gravedigger. There is one more question related to this theme. Question: why was Iblis, Satan, created? Well, as for the essence of this question, its author must address the Almighty directly. We can only observe how Iblis is used in the stream of Almightiness. The thing is that man and personality and society can develop in two ways. On the basis of love, based on inner motives to make life better, eliminate the dangers and threats that exist. Or they can develop under the pressure of circumstances. If someone is unable to develop either on the basis of love or under the pressure of circumstances, then, having exhausted God's allowance, he becomes an object of social hygiene. So, in the history of civilization, Iblis solves these two latter tasks, to create circumstances that stimulate development and eliminate those who do not want to develop, even under the pressure of circumstances. Question: why did the biblical characters live for about 1,000 years And even earlier, was there no death? When people began to betray their createdness, then death appeared, right? Well, if you believe what is reported in the Wisdom of Solomon, then yes, indeed, there was no death. But with the envy of the devil, death entered, and after the fall into sin of civilization, it became the norm of life. Is it good or bad? Well, as long as civilization leads a sinful lifestyle, it is good, because, well, a person gets tired of living under the burden of his sins. Question. So, if Moses was a Slav, and the Torah was given to Russian Jretsud, then is it this that is characterized in the Quran as the likeness of an ass carrying books? No, it is not this that is characterized, but Rus, Russia, is inherently called Holy Rus. The claim to this very name obligates in life to holiness. Well, if someone is not obliged, then he should not be surprised as to why the country lives like this, but not otherwise. Question. Are there people with plant genesis, for the reproduction of which it is necessary to use the blood of lambs? I don't know. Question. Could you please tell me, the book Economics of Innovative Development, which you and Vladimir Mikhailovich Zasnobin advertised, published by Conceptual Publishing House, with a circulation of only 1,000 copies, is this a trial circulation? You see, the situation is such that the Conceptual Publishing House conducts commercial activities, and everything that it does assumes a certain level of internal financing. Therefore, many works are published as soon as the circulation of previously published ones is sold out. Therefore, if you are not satisfied with the circulation of 1,000 copies, well, buy it quickly, so that this book will spread further. In addition, modern printing is not the same as it was, say, 100 years ago, because 100 years ago, the publication of a book was a large, very material-intensive process. Well, imagine a set. Every page is either typed from typographic letters in a certain matrix, or cast as a whole on a special machine. And there were a number of such metal-printed pages according to the number of pages in the book. Therefore, in those days, the very procedure of typing a book, in terms of technology, was very expensive, and not the lowest in cost price of publishing. Therefore, the principle was that the higher the number of copies, the cheaper the book. The lower the number of copies, the greater the proportion of this metal work was done for every copy of the book. Now, publishing technologies are different. And there are technologies that allow you to print a book simply by ordering a copy yourself. In such conditions, the number of copies for publication does not mean anything. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question is that in our time, unfortunately, there is a generation that does not read anything except for SMS messages. The maximum they can read is 1 or 2 paragraphs of some kind of text message on the internet. Are they able to understand it or not? Are they able to correlate what they read with what they knew before or not? Are they able to correlate it with life? This is an open question. But practice shows that for the most part, they are not able to. They have matured as an object for manipulation by providing them with primitive texts of a few sentences. Question: are you planning to give a full course of lectures on the Noosphere Educational Channel or elsewhere on the application of intersectoral balances based on factor costs, for example, in order to improve governorial literacy? Thank you. Well, if there is such a need, then after the presentation of the sufficiently general theory of governance is completed, we will also talk about other questions of life, including economic theories, proposed economic models. That is, this in essence is not a problem. But there should be a certain order in the presentation of information, because the Sphera project is a long-term project. Question: please tell us who sprays the so-called chemtrails from planes and why. Why are all the mass media, authorities, and others silent about this? The information on the web is extremely contradictory. I believe that the global predictor is connected with the use of chemistry, since spraying it in such volumes around the world is only possible for them. Well, who sprays this and why? I don't have specific information. Second question is related to the fact that the volume of spraying is probably greatly exaggerated, because if this were the norm, then at many airports there would be personnel who are engaged in pouring this chemical into planes, and there would be a leak of information accordingly. Therefore, if there are no such mass leaks of information covering all countries of the world, and they are inevitable under any secrecy regime, then this is an indicator that if such things are done, then they are not done on such a scale as the Internet is accustomed to telling about it. That is, there may be a certain number of special air bases which serve specially adapted aircraft for this, and they can really fly and spray something. What could the impact be? Everything related to the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons in the traditional sense. Then, you see, if the spraying occurs at high altitudes, 8,000 meters and above, then the air currents of the upper layers of the atmosphere, they will carry this to who knows where. That is, the accuracy of hitting, in this case, is extremely low. But if we talk about another aspect, about the impact on the weather, this kind of technology can really be used in a hybrid war mode to disrupt the weather over the enemy's territory, with the aim, first of all, of affecting his agriculture. But here, again, one must bear in mind that the atmosphere of the planet is a holistic system, and if you are doing something in one place, then where and how it will respond, besides this place, is an open question, and not very well amenable to predictions in the current state of computer technology and meteorology. Therefore, something is being done, but in my opinion, In many respects, everything is exaggerated. Although it is necessary to treat this carefully, attentively, and, in a number of cases, harshly suppress this kind of activity. Next question. A. Does understanding always come to all children, even animals, through noospheric images, and the guessing brain, lexical constructions, graphics, sensing, only help, prompt, in what order to unpack, connect these images, etc.? B. The internal images of the brain are deciphered through the types of texts superimposed on the corresponding noospheric thoughts forms, and in this way they are highlighted and so on. C. Man is a biocomputer. Everything is inside. The noosphere is an external data bank. Some are given access and so on. Or does this happen in some other way? Well, in fact, all three aspects, in various combinations, are present in the psyche of everyone, because something is read down in a ready-to-use form from the noosphere, something is loaded into the noosphere as a result of independent activity. Well, and a person, his brain and psyche as a whole, like a biocomputer, something inside, something outside, an exchange between them. Question. Some years ago, the changes that some people made within themselves, and these changes are the result of an objectively correct choice, led to a change in the structure of the noosphere of the Earth, and this was noticed by some somewhere very far away. It aroused the attention of certain hierarchically lower creatures by instructing them to pay attention to the Earth. The creatures paid attention, and this has already led to a large-scale reorganization, even in some civilizations, of the creatures themselves. But now the wave is coming to Earth. How would you answer or comment on this? You see, if there is any external impact, it achieves the result, then there is always the second side of the aspect. There is something in the object of impact that allows you to achieve the result. Therefore, if you do not like the external impact, then change yourself, in order that this impact does not achieve the desired by its creator's result. Next question. Still, God the Almighty does not know unequivocally how the destiny, from its plurality of variants, of humanity will develop. Otherwise, why test it? Does this mean that there is something God does not know? You see, the author should have addressed not to me with this question, but by developing his religious sense, his personal religiosity, to God. The second thing is that with the human logics of modern civilization, for evaluating the actions of the Almighty in their entirety and all-encompassingness, well, in fact, this is often not adequate. It would be wrong to say that the Almighty does not know or foresee something. But the world was not created in order that he would be convinced of something. The world was created in order that created souls, living in this world, would learn something and become co-creators of themselves. This is precisely why multivariantness is needed. That is why there is freedom of choice, and freedom of choice presupposes the right to make a mistake. In order to be convinced of the mistakenness of something, practical actions are required, which, in the event of an erroneous choice, proceed in that area of possibility, which, since ancient times, has been called God's allowance. If a person is attentive to this, then, from the area of allowance, he goes back into the area of providence. But the erroneous choice made earlier presupposes changing views on it. Moreover, changing views, not only at the level of, yes, this was done in the wrong way, but this presupposes changing views at the level of those Nravya standards that govern all information processes in the human psyche, which led, in the past, to the erroneous choice. Because, if Nravya standards are not changed, then the mistake can be repeated in different situational scenery. But the essence of this Nravya's ethical mistake will remain the same. Therefore, the question, it is precisely such that life, the world, is a school for souls, and the question is how people relate to this. Do they want to become humans, or are they quite satisfied with what is happening, or they simply put up with things, senselessly, willlessly, going through the whole stream of circumstances, someone clenching his teeth, and someone else crying. We are done with the questions for today. Now let's continue our lecture on the sufficiently general theory of governance. The previous lecture was dedicated to the working out of a conception. Further, if we go according to the entire function of governance, then comes the implementation of the conception into life. The implementation of the conception into life presupposes the implementation of a structural method of governance, or a structureless method of governance, or governance on the basis of virtual structures. Therefore, we will deal with this theme today. The simplest, of course, is the structural method of governance. The structural method of governance is most easily implemented in technology. Automatic control systems for airplanes, ships, submarines, manufacturing plants, and everything else, in the majority of cases, they are structurally compiled from some elements, each of which is functionally specialized and interacts with other structural elements. Well, if these functions presuppose, then also with the external environment with which the object of governance interacts. All the concretics of how to build such structures are described in the applied theories of governance for every sphere of activity, respectively. A special question is social governance and the formation of a structure that implements the conception into the life of society. Unfortunately, it so happened, purely historically, that the questions of building structures about the functional purpose consonants of their architecture, about the features of structures, the ability and inability of structures to solve certain tasks, are not studied in management, in sociology, or in political science. Nevertheless, this is a very important question for the life of society. There is a work on the culture of administrative activities. There, this question was raised. The essence of the matter is what? If there is a certain algorithm of governance, then it can be presented as a network model. That is, after today's lecture is over, you can search the internet for literature on network planning. Well, in short, the essence is simple. Any process can be presented as a network. How is it done? Well, a process has a beginning, a process has an end. The beginning and the end in the network planning are called events. The beginning and the end are connected by a straight line called work, with a minimum of detailedness in the consideration of the process. Any process is a beginning, work, and completion. If we increase the detailedness, then the beginning and the end of the process are preserved, but the line, which is called work, is transformed under the microscope into a network, because the beginning of the process presupposes the beginning of a certain plurality of works. The beginning of a certain plurality of works means that not one line goes from the start of the process point, but several lines corresponding to every particular work go. Every particular work ends with its own event, completion. It can continue further, it can branch, and, as a result, between the beginning of the process and the end of the process, a certain network of works appears. The whole sequence of these works, their interconnections, are reflected in this network. The difference between a block diagram of an algorithm and such a network is only one. The algorithm can contain cycles. The cycles can be different. There may be cycles, the passage of which is of a finite character. That is, entering a cycle, you know in advance how many cycles will be passed. And it may be that the number of cycles is determined by the character of its passage each time, and the results obtained as a result of each passage. The network model cannot contain cycles. It can contain hidden cycles in the form of works, which, in different variants of the network model, can have different durations. This is the fundamental difference between a block scheme of algorithm and a network model. Usually, network models are used for governance towards projects. If you know the duration of each of the particular works that are included in the network model, then there is Ford's algorithm, that allows you to find the critical path and, accordingly, the total duration of the project. All works that lie on the critical path have the property that if the duration of any of them increases in comparison with the planned one, then the duration of the entire project also increases by the corresponding time. The works that lie outside the critical path in this network, they have some margin of time for the delay of each of them. And this delay does not affect the total duration of the project. This is the standard task for which network models are used. But network models become wanted in situations where time is really pressing, and you really need to govern the project, not allowing the project to flow by itself as it is able to, but when a certain result is required by a certain time, and you need to govern it. The second aspect, which network models reveal, is in fact never used anywhere. The fact is that the organizational staff structures of enterprises, the structure of statehood, they take shape in a historically formed way, socially spontaneously. If someone's will is imprinted there, well, the founding fathers of the United States, in the architecture of the US statehood, the founder of any company who created its organizational staff structure successfully enough for the company to outlive him and continue to function. Then, organizational structures are perceived as a given, even if they contain some errors in their architecture. Now, if you look at the organizational staff structure as a way of organizing the structural method of governance, then the question arises concerning the governorially competent construction of organizational staff structures of enterprises, the construction of the structure of state power. And then it turns out that the structure either should carry the entire function of governance, or it should carry some stages of the entire function of governance, either the first ones or the subsequent ones. And besides, in some cases, the structure and its elements should be generators of structureless governance and should be able to enter into the process of governance on the basis of virtual structures. Factually, this means the following. If you want to govern or organize the process of governance, then the art of governance in society comes down to the implementation of four things: dividing the particular process of governance, which you take under your governance, into fragments, each of which should be more or less isolated from all the others. That is, it must possess the property that it can be implemented, regardless of whether other fragments are implemented. Only one thing is required: the initial materials that are needed for its beginning have to be possessed by the person who will head this fragment. Further, for the entire set of fragments, sole personal responsibility should be distributed. Sole personal responsibility is required so that the process does not generate ownerless information in relation to which a fragment or a process as a whole may turn out to be critical. If a so-called collective governance is organized, and there is no sole personal responsibility, then there will always be some information critical to the success of the project, which will not be available to any of the governors in the collective governance, and the appropriate governorial decision will not be worked out and implemented in a timely manner. Sole personal responsibility, in this case, does not mean a tyrannical way of directing subordinates. That is, it does not imply the implementation of the principle, I am the boss, all other fools must listen to me. Because a governorial decision can be worked out both on the basis of collective activity and alone. But when it comes to the implementation, the responsibility should always be solely personal. After responsibility has been distributed, powers must be distributed. Because responsibility without powers cannot be realized, and the resources that are needed for the implementation of each of the project fragments must also be distributed. So, if you do this, correlating with the network planning apparatus, network models, you will get a very simple correlation of these four principles and network models. That is, each work should be under someone's sole personal responsibility. Only events can be boundaries for the transfer of responsibility. That is, that which in relation to one work is the completion, and in relation to another work is the beginning. Completion of the previous work is one of the necessary grounds for the beginning of the next work. This can be called the transition points of discrete control. At the transition points of discrete control, the characteristics of all works are simple. Completed, not completed. There can be no work 99.8% completed. This is not completed. There can be no work 102% completed. This is also not completed. The completeness of the work presupposes the determination of the criteria of completeness, the metrological consistency of each of the criteria. And if this exists, then the organizational staff structure, or the structure of state power, any other structure of governance, can be correlated with the network model of the process that is under the governance of this structure. And there is only one requirement. There should be no ownerless fragments in the network model. That is, each fragment of the network model must correspond to an area of sole personal responsibility, and an element of the structure, its division, the functions of which include the implementation of a particular process of governance in relation to this fragment must be connected with this area of sole personal responsibility. If there are ownerless elements in the network model, then there can be anything. If they are somehow governed by someone, then this can lead to good results and to failure of the project as a whole, regardless of what you want and how you want it. You are simply hostages of the processes that end up in these ownerless fragments. If some fragments of the network model find themselves in intersecting areas of sole personal responsibility, then you should also see this. And you should understand how, in each specific case, the principle of sole personal responsibility will be implemented in such areas. Who is subordinate to whom and in what conditions? You see, many technological processes, many processes of social governance are such that it is impossible to avoid the intersection of areas of responsibility. But in the event that the areas of responsibility of two or more persons or structures intersect, there must always be someone who will coordinate their activities. It may be someone from those who already carry this responsibility, or maybe someone from the persons who govern the activities of all of them in the very same area of intersection of sole personal responsibility of many persons. Processes of social governance are such that in the majority of cases, it is impossible to build a network model as a line that would really reflect what is happening. Therefore, it is precisely the network that takes shape, and the network contains many works that require the co-participation of different specialists from different divisions in them. But in order for the results to be obtained, coordination of the activities of all of them is required in the area of intersection of this sole personal responsibility. That is, anyway, you come to the need to distribute the sole personal responsibility to someone. Now, if this is comprehended, then you can see what organizational staff structures exist at certain enterprises, how the structure of state power is organized. You can see the areas of incorrect distribution of sole personal responsibility. You can see the areas of irresponsibility. Since all particular processes lie in the stream of some encompassing processes, the areas of irresponsibility are areas through which it is possible for alien governance to enter into the process that should be under the power of this very structure of governance. Then it turns out that quite often the structure is oriented on solving some mass tasks. Mass tasks are standard, and the distribution of sole personal responsibility, powers and resources by structural elements is oriented specifically on solving these tasks. But if the structure is faced with some new tasks or rare non-standard tasks, then such a rigidly structural approach does not enable the solution of these tasks. What to do in such a situation? The bureaucratic approach is that it is necessary to create new divisions that would solve these tasks. The right approach is that the existing structure should be the basis for the personal interaction of those who can solve these rare or new tasks. And, accordingly, those duties that are prescribed by the staff schedule, the regulation on these or those divisions in this structure, they should allow flexibility in the sense that tasks requiring a non-standard solution could be solved on the basis of self-organization of the heads of these or those subdivisions, or personnel of these subdivisions. Ford wrote on this theme. He was very ironic and critical of the geniuses of organization who are able to generate an organizational staff schedule where everything, totally everything, is spelled out. And the inability to overcome the conflict between a rigid distribution, a univocal distribution of duties and powers in the existing structures, and the need of structures to solve some tasks that do not fully correspond to these powers. This is one of the big problems of governance towards enterprises, especially scientific research and design engineering ones. Therefore, the system must allow or directly prescribe to officials and sub-departments the initiative in solving tasks that do not correspond to the plurality of standard tasks for which the structure is built. In relation to the economy, what I said about network models has another aspect. If we are considering any large enterprise, then there are several such tasks of governance that must be solved in order for the enterprise to function. The first task is to govern the production process. At the majority of enterprises, this is a set of workshops interacting with each other. In each workshop, governance towards those technological processes that are characteristic of it. But the passage of the order through the production process also needs coordination. Therefore, the inevitable appearance of what is called the service of the chief dispatcher or something like that, which accepts the order for execution and ensures the passage of the order through the entire network of works that lead to the completion of this order and the transfer of products to the customer or to the finished goods warehouse. The second task is the maintenance of technological equipment, on the basis of which the production process is conducted. And it also requires its own network, its own structure, which is largely independent of the structures that carry the production process as such. Further, it turns out that the maintenance of production equipment and the operation of production equipment at the same time is in most cases impossible. Accordingly, there is a need to coordinate the activities of structures that carry the production process and structures that carry the maintenance of production equipment to maintain it in a functionally operable state. This leads to the emergence of something called a directorate, a plant governance department, which coordinates the activities of structures that carry the production process and structures that serve the production process and maintain technological equipment in a functionally operable state. Further, no enterprise is self-sufficient in terms of production and consumption of the products with which it deals. Any enterprise has value, significance, only as an element of the encompassing its production-consumption multi-sectoral system, partially localized within the state and partially outside the state. Therefore, the directorate of the enterprise also has the task of interacting with external economic entities and state power. What else remains? There remains an impact of scientific technological progress. Accordingly, if enterprises are extremely perfect in our time in the aspect of producing something, then, by strength of scientific technological progress, if we preserve it in the form in which it is, after 5, 10, 15 years, it will become hopelessly outdated and cease to be in any way significant as an element of the encompassing it system. This means that the directorate must keep the long-term development strategy of the enterprise up to date and must govern the implementation of this enterprise strategy. Moreover, the process of implementing the strategy of the enterprise is the third process that must flow within the enterprise in parallel with the two previously named: the production process, the release of products, the maintenance of technological equipment used in the production process. And according to this consideration of the tasks that should be solved at the enterprise, it turns out that the construction of the organizational staff structure of the enterprise should take into account these three tasks: the activities of the directorate, the production process, and maintenance of technological equipment used in the production process. You yourselves understand that if the activity of the directorate involves the implementation of the strategy of the enterprise, then some structures should be generated that are conditioned by the concretics of the tasks that are reflected in the development strategy of the enterprise. And, to the measure of the changing of the strategy of the enterprise, of its implementation in life, these structures must change, because if they remain unchanged, then their activity becomes an obstacle to the development of the enterprise. Well, this is basically all that can be said about the structural method of governance and its implementation in various questions of social governance. If we talk about concretics, then at many enterprises, organizational staff structures now are not an instrument of governance. The organizational staff structure is a battlefield for various groups of administrators, for power, for control over the enterprise, with the objective of obtaining various kinds of income from some activity in addition to the officially declared activity of the enterprise. In such conditions, the creation of sub-departments, the functional need for which is not necessary, is characterized by the violation of the principle of delimiting sole personal responsibility for fragments. The creation of areas where the sole personal responsibility of different people intersects, the functions of different subdivisions intersect, and the coordination of these works is carried out on the principles of sole personal dependence of the participants on someone superior. The system is built in such a way as to force one to this personal dependence and make the carrier of the coordination function irreplaceable in the process. So, this whole thing does not lead to anything good. The same applies to the construction of structures of state power. Now, if we talk about correlating the structures of state power with the entire function of governance, then history knows two most functional types of the structure of state power. The first is Egypt at the time of the pharaohs. Egypt at the time of the pharaohs is a statehood capable of carrying out the entire function of governance. Well, the film The Mummy is about those times. The film The Mummy is initially false in that if a conflict between the pharaoh and the highest jrets arises, then either the pharaoh obeys the power of the highest jretshood, or the pharaoh is buried with all the honors within the shortest possible time. Moreover, in the history textbooks of the 19th century, it was written about the fact that the highest caste that governed all, these were jretses. The pharaoh was subordinate to the jretshood. In modern history textbooks, the thing is presented in such a way that the head of state, pharaoh, was the head of everything, and the jretshood were his faithful servants. So, if you correlate with the entire function of governance, then it all was not so. The Jretsut of Egypt was represented by two teams, a decad of the north and a decad of the south. Plus, for every decad, the 11th was the first hierarch. This is now reflected in football. 11 muscle heads run after a ball. Everyone watches it, everyone is delighted, and someone, meanwhile, is engaged in global governance. Why two teams? Because each of the teams can make an error in something, and the governorial decision must be error-free, or, if not error-free, then at least to a minimal extent erroneous in relation to the circumstances. Therefore, if two teams of the highest Jretsut, exploring the problematics of life and the possibilities of solving it, come to different opinions on one and the same question, then the evaluations of such a situation are different. The first primitive evaluation, from the standpoint of the majority of today's inhabitants, is a competition between two teams in love for power. But such an evaluation is not appropriate, because the highest intrasocial power, which had already been achieved there by both teams, simply had nothing to compete in. But it was easily possible to lose the status. They could easily lose their status as a result of making erroneous decisions for implementation. Therefore, if for the ordinary man, this evaluation in the sense that they were competing in love for power is appropriate, then for themselves, if they came to mutually exclusive opinions on one and the same question, this was an indicator that someone was somehow erroneous, and it was necessary to get to the bottom of the reasons that had given rise to this error. What were the reasons for this error? Well, first, different informedness of the members of both teams. If they brought the databases together, they found out that someone did not know something, someone did not know something else, and accordingly, if they took into account the unknown by both teams, they could come to a third opinion, which would differ from the first two in some way, and would be free from the erroneousness of the first two. The second source of error: failure in the intellectual activity of someone. Failure. What is this? 2 by 2 is 4. Well, it turned out that 2 by 2 for someone was 3 to 5. To be precise, 5 in the given concrete case, and he did not notice this circumstance. And the psychological practices within these teams were aimed at detecting all the errors and proposing for implementation a third opinion, free from the initial errors. On condition that the participants of the process possessed an effective cognitive creative culture, this result was achievable. And only after the governorial decision of the conception of governance had been worked out, from that moment forward, The pharaoh, as the head of state, acquired sole personal responsibility to the highest Dreadhood for the implementation of this conception. And the pharaoh had the powers to split the project into fragments and distribute sole personal responsibility for each of the fragments further. Further, the core of officials and the periphery of the highest Dreadhood in the society itself collected information on how the project was being implemented, and, accordingly, corrections were made. The statehood of ancient Egypt, precisely in the architecture that has now been described, was capable of carrying the entire function of governance. Statehood of other types is a classical European monarchy when the king, the Tsar, alone solves all the questions, and all other loyal subjects cannot carry the entire function of governance. Precisely by strength of the fact that the stages attributed to the activities of the conceptual power of these two Jretli teams, who worked out a conception of governance, or a governorial decision, concrete in relation to a certain problem, are not properly resolved in this system. The same applies to all kinds of republics, where there is a parliament, regardless of whether this parliament is headed by the state, the pinnacle of state power, or the republic is presidential and the head of state is the president. The entire function of governance is also not realized here, for the simple reason that electoral procedures do not allow an incompetent electorate, incompetent in the field of theory and practice of governance, and incompetent in the field of gnoseology, methodology of cognition and creativity, to elect those governors who are really capable of realizing their vital interests. Otherwise, it should be admitted that the Germans, proceeding from some masochistic aspirations, in 1933 voted for Hitler's party in order to receive May 9th, 1945, in its historically known form. These systems cannot work without some political mafia acting behind the scenes, which either really carries the first stages of the entire function of governance, that is, detecting problems, working out a conception for their solution, implementing the conception in the life of the state apparatus and society. Or the periphery of this mafia penetrates into society from the outside, and the state, in the form of a presidential or parliamentary republic, loses its sovereignty by force of the fact that there is no one to carry the first stages of the entire function of governance. If we correlate with the entire function of governance, then the statehood spelled out in the Constitution of the USSR in 1936 is also a statehood, the structure of which allows to carry the entire function of governance. And look at what happened. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR included two chambers, the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities. Both chambers were equal. The decision was made if both voted for. If both chambers voted differently, the decision was not accepted. And a conciliation commission had to be created which had to detect the causes, ideally, as to why the decisions of both chambers did not coincide, and propose a third solution, for which the chambers had to vote unanimously for. Then the decision was accepted. If the decision was not accepted after the work of the Conciliation Commission, then there had to be new elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. If a decision was accepted, then the decision was transferred to the system of executive power, the Soviet of People's Commissars, under the Constitution of 1936, and subsequently to the government, and it was implemented. What was wrong in the USSR? The state planning was at the Soviet of Ministers. In fact, the Soviet of Ministers, its economic bloc, should have been under the State Planning Committee. And the State Planning Committee was supposed to act in line with the tasks set by the Supreme Soviet in the person of its two chambers. Why did the system turn out to be functionally inoperable? The answer is simple. If the Egyptian system was efficient on the basis of the cooperative isolation of the Jretsud clans from the rest of society, then the statehood, prescribed in the Constitution of the USSR in 1936, did not provide for any corporations that considered themselves more equal, the first among equals, and so on. The 1936 Constitution of the USSR was oriented towards the society in which the knowledge necessary for the implementation of conceptual power was accessible to each and every one. And, accordingly, if society itself is conceptually powerful, then it is able to elect deputies of all levels who will also be conceptually powerful and governorially competent. Well, if society is mistaken concerning someone, then the Constitution of the USSR of 1936 provided for the right to early recall of deputies if they did not cope with their duties. Another thing is that the society in 1936 did not understand this, and, therefore, the right of recall was declared in the Constitution, but was not backed up juridically procedurally. The Soviet Constitution of 1936 initially provided for competitive elections, but the bureaucratic mafia insisted that there had to be no competitive elections. The society did not oppose this either. So, you understand, the fact that the statehood prescribed in the Constitution of the USSR in 1936 did not seem to be consistent. This is an expression of one of the governorial objective laws. The system of governance must correspond, firstly, to the tasks of governance, and, secondly, to the object of governance. The system as a whole corresponded to the task of building communism as a society without the exploitation of man by man. But the society was characterized by Kluchevsky's aphorism, society of a previous community made up of scoundrels. But if not everyone was scoundrels, and not at all times, then, nevertheless, the bureaucratic mafia, isolated from society, and also permeated by the Masonic periphery, did not consider it necessary to build communism in the USSR. Therefore, it turned out to be as it turned out to be. If we analyze the statehood prescribed in the current constitution, then this is a statehood that is not capable of carrying the entire function of governance. The causes are simple. The central bank is juridically not responsible to Russia for anything. The election procedures are structured in such a way that the deputy corps is formed not by the population, but by a certain corporation that stands behind the power or is partially in the state power itself. And in order to build a pravier statehood, it is necessary to understand what the entire function of governance is and how it should be implemented in a combination of a structural method of governance, structureless governance, and governance on the basis of virtual structures. Today we discussed the structural method of governance, structureless governance, and governance on the basis of virtual structures are also big themes. So we will consider these themes next time. That is all for today. All the best to you.